We're going to wait a minute till it takes a while for everybody to enter the room, which is strange language.
Like in any room. The virtual and the physical, well.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to wait a minute before we officially start so that we can allow everybody to enter the room. Okay. Good morning and welcome to our webinar. Today we're going to talk about AI principles, and we are going to discuss with 4 people who are intimately involved with the development of principles at the OECD. And so I'm going to first thank our sponsors. And our sponsors include the Internet Society, the World Wide Web Foundation, the Center for International Governance Innovation in Canada, and the Institute for International Science and Technology, GW Cyber, which is our Center for International Business, the Institute for International Economic Policy. So we are pleased to have 4 speakers today, and what we're going to do is ask them a few questions and get their perspectives on what happened at the OECD over a period of a year. And so I'm going to begin. First, let me introduce our speakers and thank them for coming to speak with us. So we have Nicolas Miailhe from the Future Society. We have Adam Murray from the U.S. Department of State. We have Carolyn Nguyen from Microsoft, and we have Ryan Budish from Harvard Law School and Berkman Klein Center. Okay, so we're going to begin with an overview of, we're going to begin with the OECD principles. And so as he describes them, I'm going to bring them up for you all. So Adam?
Great. Well, good morning, everybody. And it's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for joining us this morning for this great conversation. While Susan brings up the principles, I'll just say a little bit more that I am at the State Department. I am our U.S. delegate to the OECD Committee on Digital Economy Policy, CDEP for short. And the committee was responsible for developing these principles in partnership with a group of experts back in 2018 and 2019. And since then, they've become adopted as an OECD recommendation and subsequently endorsed by a number of other organizations, including the Group of 20. So we're, from a US government perspective, we are, there we go, very pleased with the outcome of these principles. And I'll run through them quickly just as a way to level set our conversation a little bit so we all know what we're talking about. The goal really was to foster this policy ecosystem for trustworthy AI. I'll say that when I came on to this role in about 2 years ago in 2018, I think the timing was really right for governments to come together and say something about artificial intelligence. Certainly, there'd been a lot of talk of AI for some years before that, and really decades, going back even further. But I think the moment was right. There were a lot of sets of principles already being put forward by various think tanks or universities or companies themselves or groups of companies. And so there was a lot of interest in this and a lot of really robust discussion. The OECD principles are the first time that governments have come together to agree on this set of principles. These slides are adopted from the OECD, and so they use the word standard here. I'll just point out it's not really a technical standard, but it is more, it is a set of principles. As I mentioned, they were adopted in May of 2019, and then since subsequently endorsed by the G20. They called them something a little bit different, but they were almost word for word exactly the same. One key thing to point out about the principles in terms of how they were developed was that it really was a multi-stakeholder process. And I've got three co-panelists here who were part of that process, and I think they really represent the variety of stakeholders that were involved. So, me from the U.S. government perspective, we have Nicolas from civil society, Carolyn from private sector, Ryan from an academic background. But we also had a strong participation by labor representatives, the technical community, other international organizations as well. And I think that was really important in bringing lots of different voices to the table. And one thing to note is that what came out of that process was a consensus document. And so even though you can imagine that some of these issues are sometimes really tough to discuss, this group of stakeholders came together and was able to find common ground. Just a word on OECD recommendations to note that they are not legally binding instruments, but they do have a sort of moral force behind them. Countries that adhere to them really do try and do their best to implement them. And there is a peer review process that takes place to see how countries are doing vis-a-vis each other within the OECD. Maybe we could go to the next slide there, Susan, and we'll just briefly talk about the structure of the principles, and hopefully you've seen this already. If not, I would encourage you to go to oecd.ai, that's the policy observatory. The principles are spelled out there, and really there's even more context provided about what we mean by each of these principles. But we've divided them up into two parts. The first half are principles for responsible stewardship of trustworthy AI. And these speak to some of the values discussions that I think many will be familiar with in terms of inclusive growth, human-centered values, things like fairness, bias, transparency and explainability, robustness, security, safety, accountability. I don't want to get into all of these here. Again, I encourage you to go and look at the Policy Observatory to read what each of these say. But I think if you look at that top group, they do a nice job of concisely addressing many of the issues that I think had been identified in other sets of principles at the time. The second part of the recommendation focuses on national policies. And so these are directed really more towards governments who are the adherents to the recommendation. It discusses things like investing in AI R&D, fostering a digital ecosystem, so thinking about all of the supporting technologies that would go into an AI environment, providing the enabling policy environment, so both in terms of regulation, standards, other policies, human capacity, preparing for labor market transitions, and then international cooperation. So you can see that the two sets are slightly different. The first, again, is really targeted more towards all AI actors, so not just governments, but private sector, civil society, labor unions, and others, anybody who's really involved in sort of the AI system life cycle. And then the second half are more directly targeted towards government policymakers. These are very high-level principles, and they're super 100,000-foot level here presented on this slide. There is more detail in the actual recommendation, and again, if you go to oecd.ai, you'll see that. But what we're doing now at the OECD and through a new network of experts on AI is to take these principles and move down to the level of practice. And we're working on developing implementation guidance to help show how to apply these principles or how to think about them in various contexts and from various stakeholder perspectives. So I'll end there. Susan, thanks so much.
Thank you so much. So how do these intersect with other principles that have been issued, such as the G7? Is that something you could talk about?
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. Well, the OECD principles, so there are no G7 principles yet. There is this plan put forward by France and Canada to create a global partnership on AI, which in a way will bring like-minded countries, meaning the G7 countries, around a common set of values. We know that the charter of values will come up, but it's not yet been publicized. Though the flavor that we got from the recent G7 meetings point to a charter of values that tries really to uphold the best from more democratic, liberal, and social values. And really what the G7 here is trying to do is to create a group of like-minded countries. And so you can expect a very deep intersection between this G7 charter and the OECD principles. First and foremost, all G7 countries, if I'm not mistaken, are part of the OECD. So they have all signed on to the OECD principles. And should I say that when the OECD principles were adopted in May of 2019, immediately after that in June of 2019, during the G20, not G7, the G20 meeting, they got endorsed, even beyond G7. So, but I think that when I look at the text and the context of what the G7 is trying to achieve vis-a-vis what the OECD is achieving, there is, it seems, and really pushed by the United States, in my view, a stronger emphasis on human rights and democracy. And what the G7 is really pushing through this idea of a group of like-minded countries is that in a way we have really identified what we don't want in terms of the AI society. We know what we don't want. We typically don't want some of the activities we're seeing emerging in and out of China vis-a-vis human rights and surveillance. We know we don't want an Orwellian society. And so this group of G7 countries is really drawing the line vis-a-vis that. And it's very important to know what you don't want when you want to build a future society. It's very important to build your practices upon a series of principles. And let's be honest, it's also a quite natural process to identify a community of values against something else, against someone else. We know it's dangerous. It should not be abused, but this principle and this process of identification by opposition in terms of the values and the social project we want or we don't want is a very important tool to build communities of values at a national and international level. The last point I'll mention on that is that a very typical challenge that are confronted when you invent this principle is this to engineer the right kind of feedback flow between principles and practices, like Adam was saying. What we've been trying to do at the OECD, but what I've seen done as well at the European Union level with the high-level expert group, and now what I'm seeing done at the UNESCO with the standard-setting instrument on AI ethics, which is being developed, is the kind of dialogue between principles and practice. Obviously, setting a set of principles equates establishing in a way a moral compass. It's in a way a constitutional approach. What do we want to achieve is established through a constitutionalized principle. So the moment these principles are set, and it's what the OECD really wanted to do in the case of OECD, set a series of principles which can stand the test of time. And so these principles are not supposed to move over the years. And yet we know that the technology and techno-scientific evolutions and industrial applications are going to evolve. So one of the greatest challenges that we've seen at the OECD and also at the European Union level is to engineer this dialogue. And how it is done? Well, in the type of conversations that these multi-stakeholder expert groups have over the framing of these principles, we naturally try to stay away from solely conceptual conversations, but move right into very concrete use cases and applications. And that's why it's so important to have industry, trade unions, civil society organization, academia to move and navigate across the entire stream from fundamental research to business solutions which have an impact on users and consumers. And I think that when I see what the G7 is trying to do is trying to learn and grasp out of the global partnership on AI, the best from what has been done, achieved, and didn't work so well at the EU level, within the OECD, And I think it's gives me the important hope. Very last point, I think it's important. We often see critique against the so-called proliferation of principles. Well, as for me, I think the idea of ensuring that each community of values of interest can adapt and translate into its own reality of a practical reality, a series of principles, is something which is very important. If you were going to dream for only one set of universal ethics principles, you would generally enter into contradictions between the very universal and the very plural. It's all about reconciliation between the universal and plural. And pluralism matters. It's about self-determination at the local, at the very national, at the very regional. And so the proliferation across layers of governance and also across communities of practice, industry, engineers, doctors, is something that I think we should see in positive ways, so long as we manage to build a coherence across these layers of principles.
Thank you.
Susan, can I
Please,
add something
go
to
ahead,
that?
Ryan, please.
I just wanted to say, and I think Nika did a great job of summarizing there, that some of my colleagues at the Berkman Klein Center recently published a really interesting report back in January that looked at about 36 different sets of AI principles, including the OECD principles. And what they did was they identified 8 common themes that that bridge across most of these sets of principles. And I think this gets to what Nicolas was just saying, that that what we've seen is that over time, because the 36 or so principles came out over a period of about 18 months or 2 years, that there's actually been an increasing amount of consistency in how the principles have addressed those 8 themes. But of course, the real question, though, is even though you see now in the more recent principles that most of them are addressing almost all of these 8 key themes, that the real devil is in the details. You know, how each of the sets of principles are going to interpret what those mean, because they do operate at such a high level that's where we're really going to see a lot more experimentation and differences as these different sets of principles get interpreted. But I think it is important to recognize that at least at the broadest level, there does seem to be across many different sets of principles in emerging consensus, which I think is a good thing that we should appreciate.
Okay, that is such an important point. Thank you. I just want to encourage our participants, please use at the bottom of the screen, you can see a Q&A, and we really want to bring you into the discussion. So please give questions for our speakers here. We look forward to seeing them. Let me ask a question of Carolyn. How is this going to change practice, Carolyn? Like, what's happening at Microsoft in response to these principles?
Sure. Thanks so much, Susan, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this discussion. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I want to build on the messages from Adam and Nico and Ryan, and speak to the point that Ryan brought up, which is what next now that we have a commonality and a very firm foundation to build upon. And when I say the firm foundation, it really is that in the sense that it is work that was done by the within a multi-stakeholder group, and has now been accepted by governments as well as international organizations around the world. As it stands today, the OECD principles are the most widely accepted by governments around the world. And also have been the basis, are becoming, for additional initiatives, such as, for example, the Fair Lack initiative that is being led by the IDB, and other initiatives under consideration in Africa, etc. So in terms of, you know, these particular principles and going into this next phase, Ryan is absolutely right that these are high level. They were designed by the whole group to be high level, to say that they want to put out, you know, sort of to enable a directionally correct development and deployment of AI systems. And in that light, the principles are entitled to provide guidance, but not be prescriptive, so as to enable further innovation, as well as you know, further research in terms of how these principles would be implemented, in terms of how to identify, you know, potential risks, but in particular, as these principles are being implemented in the different contexts, in the different sectors, in the different applications, what are the additional areas that will come up? And in that light, the principles really provide a practical and sufficiently generic framework that is common. In developing the principles, what we also said is, although they're high level, the group put together and promote certain practices, for example, risk management. So at the same time as we're being high level, we're trying to be practical to say, hey, as you're looking at developing and deploying AI technologies and systems, consider the fact that the risk to these principles can happen throughout the entire process. And so use these kinds of approaches to identify potential risks to each of the principles, and also identify risk mitigation measures and try to document them so that you can improve transparency as well as address accountability of the systems. So to the point that, you know, that this is a common framework, in effect a common vocabulary that can now be used by the group to discuss the best practices, that's how it's useful. I want to pick up on where Adam left off in terms of this next stage. So the OECD, in terms of implementation, with the One AI expert group, there will be 3 working groups to take this to help with the implementation. The first working group will look at classification of AI systems. In other words, what is AI? And part of this is so that governments can measure the development of AI, etc. The second group, which Adam is the lead and I'm a co-moderator, is to focus on implementation guidance for trustworthy AI systems. And in this particular case, going back to that common framework, what we are just launching out is a request to collect practical implementations, case studies, etc., for each of the principles, but also what are the governance process that's being implemented in different organizations, what's the governance framework, what codes of practices are out there, what are some of the standards that's being considered, what are some of the research that are going on that relate to this, what are existing regulations. And the idea is that we will go through an initial period where we collect the evidence, and then also what we're asking for is, what are the barriers, what are the gaps, what areas do you think based on your implementation need further study. And at the end of this process, which will happen in the latter part of this of the summer, what we're hoping is to look at this evidence and then develop a framework that can help actors in implementing the principles for trustworthy AI. The third working group in the group of AI expert is to provide implementation guidance on national policies. So again, it's very much, you know, very consistent with the OECD approach, which is, you know, let's collect the evidence, understand what's there, and understand what still needs to be done. So with that, I'll stop, and we can give additional information, share additional thoughts and insights as the questions arise.
Again, I want to encourage all of our participants to ask questions. Right now, we only have one, and this is for you, so please do ask some questions to these experts. Does anyone else want to comment on the approach to implementation, moving from principles to actual practice? Please.
Well, a lot has been said, and let me give you a few examples of things that we are working on at the French Society, but also Microsoft is doing it, DKC is doing it. So practically, we are looking at cocktails of self, soft, and hard regulations. And the smartness of these cocktails is very important because you want to hard code into hard regulation the least possible thing, because we know that hard law is not very nimble. So you want to leave what really needs to be there. The more you can hard code into self-regulation, cultural practices within corporations, cultural practices into any form of organization that deals with data management and advanced algorithmic processing. And so that's one aspect. Now, a few examples. Where we're talking here about codes of conduct, that's in a way self-regulation. We're talking about and working actively on frameworks for independent auditing and certifications of AI systems. And this can take several forms. We will be releasing at the end of the month of June a work with the Ernst & Young, a big auditing firm, where we have basically run a global survey of 500 business leaders and policymakers to basically map and do a gap analysis, as we call it, between perceptions of policymakers and business leaders on prioritization of AI ethics principles versus a series of use cases. So we consolidated a list of AI ethics principles, including building upon the work that Ryan mentioned. And we used that to run a survey to see what are the big differences. And you see that there are big differences in terms of perceptions. I won't, in a way, spoil what will be announced at the end of June, but basically there is a pretty solid alignment around privacy and privacy protection between business leaders and policymakers. The alignment over fairness and algorithmic biases is not totally there yet. And this is one of the big AI ethics principles. As we move from a center of gravity around data collection and storage into a center of gravity of regulation towards processing, these notions of fairness are not totally well aligned. So, and why Ernst & Young is interested in that, because as an independent auditor, they will serve down the line, or they could serve, like many other corporations, as a kind of foot soldier to implement these frameworks of independent auditing and certifications. We could talk about benchmarking protocols. Organizations such as the National Institute for Science and Technology, NIST, have in the past played a big role and will continue to play a big role to benchmark as a trusted third party performances over complex processing to create a level playing field of understanding across industrial providers and industry applications. And there are many other applications. And I will close on this. We can look at the text with principles, and it's a very necessary condition, but not sufficient. We need principles, but as we have discussed, it's not sufficient. And it's not sufficient to the point that if you have principles without practice, you pretty quickly end up without principles. North Korea, in its constitution, is a democracy. The text is heavily democratic. It's the same for the former Democratic Republic of East Germany. It was very, on the text of the constitution, very democratic. But if you looked at the context, set of practices, well, it became clear that it was not so much democratic. So principles without practice is a very dangerous endeavor, which is not sufficient. And that's why to create the infrastructure of trust, to create trustworthy AI, we need the infrastructure of trust. We need all these sets of codes of conduct, auditing certifications, and so on and so on. It's more than the devil is in the detail. It's more than the devil. The salvation lies in the detail.
Would anyone like to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to add that I think, as we think about this process of moving from principle to practice, which is something that we're doing a lot with at the Berkman Klein Center, we're very much at a stage where I think there's a lot of value in really just information exchange between different groups in the private and public sector that are thinking about these issues, because we've been having a lot of conversations with, for instance, big companies, small companies, everything in between, and there's a tendency at this stage for groups that are coming at this from very much the right place. They want to bring these principles into their work, to think that the challenges that they're facing are unique to them at this moment, when in fact there's a lot of shared commonality in the challenges that organizations are facing. And I think there's a real value at this stage in shining a light on the ways in which organizations are trying to move from principle to practice so that the rest of organizations that are facing the same challenges don't have to repeat the same mistakes over and over and over again. So I think that there's a real value as we try to establish what these common best practices are to really have that kind of information exchange.
Adam, Carolyn, did you want to add anything?
I'll just add one thing, which is that, in particular, when you start to talk about implementation, the question of impact will be how deep the implementation can be carried out by all of the organizations in this ecosystems. And in that, we really need to really be thinking about some of the smaller organizations, like the SMEs, for example. And so the question here is, how do you enable those organizations really to also consider this without severely hampering their product development process? And so that's also a part of what we're thinking about as we try to discuss, what is that overall framework? And in the group, I was really heartened to say, to see that there's a lot of questions about what is that toolkit, to use more generically, right? So if you go from, sort of what Nico was talking about, which is there is this broader framework that has, regulation, codes of conduct, best practices, standards, and then incorporate kind of what Ryan is saying. How do I, as an organization of under 20 people, still make sure that what I'm putting out will do the right thing within this context? And that's the challenge when we think about implementation and realizing this. And that's what we're hoping to start cracking open, with this next phase of discussion and work.
Adam?
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm not sure there's much I can add after all of those great interventions, but let me just say that, at least from my perspective, I expect the work of the OECD and in particular the network of experts to be iterative, right? I mean, we're not going to come up with all of the best practices in one go. It's an evolving field, and as we dive into it, we see how important context is. I think somebody has pointed out to me in another setting that context appears in the recommendation like 40 times. So it does matter. It matters what part of the AI system lifecycle you're in. It matters what type of AI actor you are, whether a developer or a consumer or sort of just a subject. So all of these things are very complex, which is why we're going to have to keep coming back and looking at it again. I think that's one of the strengths of the policy observatory, and why we've tried to push all of that, push this work there, because it does provide for a more iterative process. It's something that's live that we can continue to update. I wanted to maybe take a stab at one of the questions from Antonio in the Q&A there.
Let me do that, because we try to keep them anonymous. So how does this sync with the OECD open data, open government data? Will there be open AI principles? There you go.
Okay, so I guess I would say that this fits into a broader work stream, a broader context of work at the OECD around digital economy policy. And so if you take a look at the preamble to the recommendation, it cites a number of other OECD recommendations that are out there. And so certainly the OECD privacy guidelines and recommendation on cross-border data flows is really important. That's something that's being updated now, it's being reviewed right now, and we're not sure if it needs a revision at this point. But I think there's a recognition that's come out of this review process that, AI has implications for privacy that we need to consider. And so that's just one example, right? Open data, I think, is part of that as well. There are other OECD recommendations that talk about access to data in specific contexts. Right now, the OECD has a work stream on enhancing access to and sharing of data. And it's published a report that you can go and take a look at, but we're looking at, are there general principles about access and sharing of data that are sort of high level that we could call out that would apply across sectors and be useful in a number of different contexts. And so that's a possibility for future work.
But some of these questions focus on various types and sources of data, how that data is collected, by whom, for what, etc. And the principles really don't say anything about the governance of various types of data. And you're saying they're connected to other existing OECD, but some of these questions are getting at it very specifically. Like, have you thought about the data that satellites collect? Should that be governed differently from, for example, personal data, even though satellites may collect aggregated personal data?
Sure, Susan, if I may take a stab at that. One of the things is that if you take a look at, so there is data collection writ large, and then there is data use by AI systems, right? So I want to at least put that on the table and clarify that. So if you take a look at the work that was done within the AI lifecycle, there is recognition of the integral part of data would play. So if you take a look at that, there is data collection, data curation, and data plays a part throughout the entire lifecycle in terms of, verification, validation, during deployment, etc. So the data, the governance of the data that is being used as an integral part of the development of the AI technologies and systems development and deployment, the principles would apply to that as well. It's not a separate set of principles. Now, having said that, so as far as AI specifically is concerned, the data that's being used for the system would comply with the same principles. But then if you start to look at, the broader conversation of data governance, that's the project that Adam referred to in terms of enhanced access to and sharing of data. And that covers the entire spectrum of data, and it covers also the various different uses of data. It also covers the access of sharing of data, from between just two organizations to completely publicly open. So that entire spectrum is also being addressed. But hopefully I answered your question specifically as it relates to data governance for AI systems.
And if I can jump in there, I mean, I think there's sort of two important things to think about in terms of the OECD principles themselves, and they both connect back to the high level of generality of those principles. The first is that and what I think is a good contribution is that the OECD principles provide a definition of what they call an AI system, which contextualizes the technology itself within the broader space of the data that goes into the system and how it's used by people in the real world. And it's a very broad definition of what an AI system is. And then you couple that with the fact that the principles themselves are so broad. I think what you end up with is that you have principles that I think, and this is true across many different sets of principles, and why I think there is this sort of high level of agreement across them. You end up with principles that are really committing to things that really shouldn't be objectionable. AI should promote well-being. It should be safe. Things like that. But the real question then comes down to things that exist below the level of these principles when you get into things like using AI in an educational system. like when you're talking about kids and in K through 12, for instance, and these principles were not intended to address that specific implementation question. They were intended to provide the framework in which then in specific contexts you can localize and further define within the context of those principles how to try to answer the question of how to implement them. And it provides the flexibility to really try to define what does well-being mean in a K through 12 setting, what does safety and security mean in the use of AI in the judicial system, and so each of those may have very, very different implementation processes and answers, but hopefully within the context that the principles provide and the framework that the principles provide.
Well, one quick point I'd like to add upon that, and that's why and where we need several layers, coherent layers of AI principles. Personalized education, AI-enabled personalized education is one of the most fascinating use cases for the implementation of AI. Potentially heavily emancipating, potentially heavily alienating. We're talking about nothing less but free will here, the very core of free will. And so the ways in which we are going to ethically align, responsibly adopt, and deploy AI to move towards the revolution in education, because remember, the future of work, we need to change the ways in which we impart skills, is one of the most important questions. And that, because the AI revolution is global, more and more these questions are being asked, not so much at the national level, but at the continental level and the global level. So one of the reasons why we're working with UNESCO in this standard setting instrument is because UNESCO has a mandate which, as you know, cuts across a number of areas, including culture, science, technology, and very importantly, education. And for us, it is a way to hopefully impact and influence the ways in which, because the devil is in the detail, you can innovate at the level of the practice and principles and hopefully disseminate, as I said before, the best from more liberal, democratic, and social values. And we can discuss them. There should be a little bit of room for discussion. But the work that UNESCO is embarking upon for the next 2 years is important as far as we are concerned. For example, because behind UNESCO, there is this very critical use case of personalized education. And I'm talking about personalized education, for example, in Asia, in Africa, where, the Sustainable Development Goals, the fight against climate change and uplifting people out of poverty is an important thing. And I could give you a few other examples of relevant international organizations. And I know there was a question on what others in the UN systems are doing. So it's one part of the answer. The other one is, as you may have seen, the United Nations Secretary General, which is supposed to embody the widest community, not the universal, but the global, assembled last year a high-level panel on digital cooperation, co-chaired by Melinda Gates, a foremost American citizen and a woman, and Jack Ma, a foremost Chinese citizen and a man. And they submitted their report last year. And now the panel is working on the implementation side of these recommendations. And there are a few recommendations that naturally intersect heavily with what we have discussed. I'll give you 2 examples. 1B, on creating digital common goods, data sharing. Not only, it goes way beyond common goods. It's important, aspirational. And 3C, on, for example, algorithmic accountability and auditing. I think that the Secretary General of the UN will release within the next few weeks a digital cooperation roadmap, which is basically bringing these recommendations into practice. But let's be clear, when we have 190 plus countries around the table on the one hand, and when on the other hand, we've got, for example, 7 only countries, G7, the kind of articulation of agreement that you can achieve at 190 is going to, invariably dilute a lot of what you can achieve, because this community of values confronted with this huge change imposed on us by technology, on privacy, on fairness, and so on free will. 190 countries, what can you achieve together? Well, and yet, that's what I was saying at the beginning, we really need to articulate the very global with the very region. That's why it's a very difficult task, but very important task.
Thank you for that. Carolyn, you mentioned that that participants are working on a classification scheme for AI. What are some of the types or categories that you're including?
Thanks, Susan. So what I can say is that so basically that particular working group is really being led by AI researchers who are looking to try to describe an AI system in terms of, so is it machine learning? Is it, what gets included so that, so for example, if you're looking at video classification system, should that be part of AI? And some of this gets really, really deep into the technical details. And the reason why this is important is that there is, for example, Microsoft maintains a Microsoft Academic Graph, which is basically a collection of all technical and research papers that are published out there. And then the question becomes, let's say that if a country wants to look at what papers it has published in AI, then what are the technical research papers that should be counted towards this? Or if it wants to look at, technology that it is producing or its researchers are producing in terms of innovation on AI, and this would help to provide additional insights on the national policy that Adam was talking about earlier, then it needs to understand where it is right now and what its researchers are working with researchers from other countries on. So this gets really heavy into the technical details of what counts as AI. Does that help to answer some of your question? And Ryan, I don't know if you'd like to add to that as well.
No? Okay, what about reaching out to K-12 and post-secondary students who will be implementing these principles? How can you help them? Does anyone want to tackle that? It's going beyond governments, beyond firms, but trying to get this into the educational system and practice.
And civic engagement, when there is so much of an epistemic crisis. The loss of trust of the people into their governments in the global north, in the global south, is such that, and the revamping of the social contracts forced upon us, upon societies by the rise of AI, is demanding. That's why I'm very happy when we draw the line to uphold the best from our democratic values. Let's stay true and let's be ambitious. The best of our democratic values is not only a question of one elections every 4 years, it's a question of engagement day after day in a way that harnesses the best from AI. And deliberative democracy in the age of AI is potentially very promising, potentially very alienating, because when we shift the point of intermediation away from the media to algorithmically aided media, we run the risk of obfuscation, of loss of trust. And so it's very important that to harness the power of AI applied to deliberative democracy, we are all the more explainable, accountable, transparent, and how you can hear me unfold these principles. They become very, very important. And indeed, for the youth to basically engage with the power and the risk of AI, yes, there is the need, there needs to be an unprecedented effort in civic engagement. At the Free Society, we are leading an effort with our friends from Canada, from the Montreal Institute of Learning Algorithm, Miailhe, and with the University of Montreal, which is called the AI Civic Forum, which is a platform to engage across societies and within societies at the level of citizens, to give citizens the capacity to influence the shaping of these AI ethics principles. And we're very happy to have started to work, for example, with UNESCO, and we hope to be working with the Global Partnership on AI to basically bring citizens' voice in a way that inform the development of these AI ethics principles, because this is very much at the point of friction, of usage, of frictional in terms of people who consume this data processing, that we can learn how to make these principles into better practices.
Anyone comment? Go ahead, please, Ryan.
One thing that I would add to that, the Berkman Klein Center has a team called the Youth and Media Lab that looks at, in particular, how kids between the ages of like 8 and 15 or so, how they think about digital technologies, including AI. And I think one of the things that's come out of their research, and they do a lot of focus groups with young kids, a lot of surveys with young kids, work directly with them. One thing that's come out of their work is that a lot of times groups and policymakers and private sector organizations sort of treat kids as in a very paternalistic way, as they're either victims or wards, and yet there's a lot of value in treating kids as partners in this process. So when you're developing an AI technology that kids may use or may impact kids, they should be a part of the process of helping to design it. And because, for a variety of reasons. The first is that through that experience, the designers will learn more about the unique ways that kids will approach the technology and interact with it and think about it. And ultimately will make it both a better, more useful product, but also a safer one. And so when we think about how do we incorporate kids into the process of moving from principle to practice, one answer is that they should be a part of that process. It's not something that governments should just be operating on their own, thinking, oh, well, we have to take steps X, Y, and Z to protect kids, and make that decision without actually consulting kids and engaging kids. Because in the research that we've seen, kids actually are very sophisticated in how they think about these technologies.
And kids are driving the popularity of various technologies. Can you say TikTok? Does anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah, even infrastructure. Kids have already made history in AI. The graphical processor units, GPUs, as we call them, which have been so instrumental in pushing forward the computing power. This is what has empowered Geoffrey Hinton, Yoshua Bengio, and Lequin to really work with deep reinforcement learning algorithms. These GPUs are the fruit of all teenagers gluing themselves to video games. Yeah, have already have a huge impact. There are a few dirty little secrets in the history of AI. One is this one. The other one is adult entertainment. And we can turn a blind eye to these things or consider them because they play a role. But what I mean to say is that digital entertainment, and I'm taking the extreme, okay, the sinful industry in entertainment, they have played a role. And as far as video games are concerned, they will continue to play a big role. Computer vision and the huge leaps in computer vision, I would argue, are partially, not only, but partially the result and the fruit of the addiction of teenagers around the world. And I use the word addiction, which is problematic, as we know. Addictions of teenagers around the world to the video games. So ethically aligned video games, considering the role of teenagers, is going to be very important. So I fully subscribe to what Ryan was saying.
Well, here's a question for Adam. Considering the impact that AI has on production and trade of goods and services, do you think that the OECD principles on AI can inform negotiations of rules on digital trade? They don't say anything about it right now.
They don't say anything, but I guess I would say that as others have noted on the panel, that the high level nature of the principles, I think, does lend them to applicability in across a variety of sectors. To be very honest, I'm not a trade expert, and so I don't want to comment on whether or not it would specifically apply to trade negotiations. I will say, though, that at the OECD, there is a trade committee. They are looking at the implications of AI. And so that work is being considered. But unfortunately, I just don't have a lot of specifics to provide you in response to that question.
Would anyone else like to comment? No? Well, I'm actually doing an analysis of what's being discussed in trade agreements about AI and what has been discussed. And proposals talk about AI generically in the US in its trade agreements, as you probably know. has language encouraging governments to put public data in machine-readable format, but they say nothing about trust or interoperability or ethics. So, or, you know, the principles, and, you know, should they be there?
Well, as you know, there is a big topic of transatlantic cooperation around the taxation, and it intersects with trade, the taxation of digital services. The Europeans, led by the French, wanted to impose a tax on the digital added value, which led to countries, Europe and the US, demanding, in a way, an adjudication from the OECD on that. And that naturally intersects with the rise of AI. That's why any work, and we're doing some work, like others, on trying to help map and measure the industrial added value chain of AI and the industrial added value chain of data, well, precisely to create the right pathways to smart taxations and provide the governments and international organizations with way to better coordinate, better converge around smart taxation schemes, because we know that one of the big topic that cuts across trade is the ways in which, and we hear a lot in the discussion around trade, an intersection between trade and taxation. Europeans now are talking a lot about a carbon tax at the border of the free trade area, basically at the common market, the single common market. And the same is appearing in the background around digital services, which more and more revolve around data processing through advanced algorithms. So we are going there.
Thank you.
Susan, just adding some thoughts onto the into the discussion is, for example, the need to share data within appropriate context, and the current context that we're all sitting in is COVID-19. And the importance of sharing data to enable better research and understanding on the impact, the spread of the diseases, the mutation of the virus, and the research on vaccines, you know, etc. And so, you know, for example, there was a question earlier on about what is being done. So, as you know, WHO is working with national public health offices, you know, etc., to try to collect information on this. So a question here is, should there be, and I think that this is part of the work under the enhanced access and sharing of data, is within context, are there some principles around responsible sharing of data to address certain, you know, global challenges? The answer on this, I don't think that there's a clear pat answer on this, because it is incredibly context dependent, but there are some fundamental principles to guide the conversation by. You know, going back to, you know, sort of closing the loop on the need for that high level framework, and then implementation of this within particular context. You know, what is privacy preserving in the sharing of data for COVID-19 to enable the analytics necessary? So I think I just want to bring up that point, because it is very much about having a set of framework, a set of principles that form the foundation for the conversation, and then coming together to ensure responsible use of data and responsible development of technology that can be trustworthy.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one final question, and then I just want to give you a chance to say final remarks too. And that question is about, well, you know, the OECD is a club of middle income and rich countries. That was poorly phrased, but I think everyone gets my point. What are you doing to help developing countries where access to next generation technology is lacking?
I can say a few words as to what we're doing on that, but you can go, Adam, if you want, no problem.
Sure. Well, I mean, one thing I would say is certainly the recommendation acknowledges and recommends the importance of international cooperation. It's not just with OECD members, but to a broader group of countries as well. And I think you see that already in that some non-OECD members have signed up to the OECD principles. They've been endorsed by the G20. You know, one mechanism in particular that I think is really important is around the OECD Policy Observatory, so OECD.ai. We really do think that that's a good platform to share to share the work of the OECD broadly on AI, because it's coming up, as I mentioned, in the Trade Committee and the Health Committee and Education Committee and all sorts of other places. So to disseminate that work to a broader audience, but also to solicit input from a wider group of stakeholders on good practices and to make those available. So I think that's one way that we're going to do it. The OECD is not it's not a technical agency. It's not administering grants or things like that to build technical capacity. And so I think that's still something that would be left to other organizations or to bilateral government arrangements.
Thank you. Does anyone want to add final comments? Nico?
Yeah, well, we've been working with the multilateral donors, including the World Bank, and hopefully we'll be publishing, and this is where we met, Suzanne, in the pre-launch of our report with the World Bank on harnessing AI for development, where with them, with the global practice on digital development, we're coming up with the first framework and a policy playbook for the responsible adoption and accelerated, because the challenge in the Global South is not only responsible adoption, it's responsible leapfrogging adoption, which is creating specific challenges there. And so it's really around capacity building and trying to mix the catch up around digital development while building AI capabilities in parallel, that too ethically aligned in contexts where capacity is not at times huge. At times the diffidence over governments is huge. I mean, suspicious in many cases in developing countries, the market is preferred in spite of the government because the level of distrust, because of corruption, because of lack of capacity. So it's yes, it's a set of challenge. And for us, there was a question in terms of what preoccupies me the most. Was the biggest challenge is this one. Is this one, the AI divide? If we don't pay attention, the AI divide will create massive problems for us. And that's why we're focusing and working a lot with the multilateral donors. World Bank is the biggest one, but there are many others. Bilateral by countries. I think it's a very important priority.
Yeah,
Carolyn?
just to add to the list, I mentioned earlier on the FAIRLAC effort, which is being headed by the IDB, the International Development Bank, in addition to the World Bank. And there's been a number of conversations as well on this at venues such as the Internet Governance Forum and various community outreach to try to share best practices in terms of the implementation and understanding where the principles apply and where there needs to be further work and research. And for this community, Susan, that you run, and we would appreciate all input into the work, because we need input from all the stakeholders and from everyone at the table on this.
Just to add to what's been shared, we've at the Berkman Klein Center, we've been working with the International Telecommunications Union and their collection of ICT regulators around the world, including many in the Global South. And we've also been working with several countries in Latin and South America. And one of the things that we find really important in those discussions is that there's sometimes a tendency to view AI as this entirely new thing that has totally new problems and new challenges, when in fact, in many cases, we view it as something that's actually amplifying existing challenges, that those challenges existed before, they continue to exist, and we need to focus on addressing those. And those are things like broadband infrastructure. We know that AI requires vast amounts of data. It can generate vast amounts of data. That data needs to be moved. And so if you don't have broadband infrastructure, that's going to hamper your ability to adopt AI. And that's not a new problem. That's things that many of these countries have already been trying to work on. Same with STEM education. If you don't have a strong foundation in STEM education, then it's going to make it that much harder to advance AI. But again, that's not a new problem. And so I think one of the things that's really important for us is to is to remind folks that just because AI is this new thing that's out there that people are focused on, that it actually just means that they should really continue to invest and refocus on the foundational things that have been important and remain important, like education, like infrastructure, and those just become all the more important.
And R&D. Thank you all so much for taking the time to explain all this to us. And in the audience, if you have further questions, please get in touch, and in turn, we'll get in touch with the speakers. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, speakers. And our next webinar will be Denmark is the only country to have an ambassador to Silicon Valley and to Chinese tech companies. And so we're going to talk with Denmark's deputy tech ambassador, because they're hiring a new ambassador, so the deputy is taking over. But we're going to learn a lot from him, and that'll be 2 weeks from today. Thank you, people in the audience, and we look forward to hearing from you, and we really appreciate your participation and questions. All the best to our speakers, and all the best to you. Thank you. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.